All right, tonight on Square Dance Callers Talking, I have the unique honor of talking to a gentleman I've never had the opportunity to meet before. And he is in California also. We're going to talk some more about that. Tonight I have Kip Garvey. How are you, sir?
Well, I'm just fine. Fine, Charlie. How about you? What's
I'm
going on
very
on your
good, sir.
side of the continent?
Not a whole lot. The Braves are getting beat up on by the Phillies. As I've got my Brave stuff on, and so it looks like they're going to go down 2 games to 1. Fantastic. So we're dealing with that. But other than that, we're doing quite well.
Well, hockey season starts in a couple of weeks, so
It does. It certainly does. We lost the hockey in Atlanta a few years back, so that's a shame. We really enjoyed when we had the Atlanta team here, but that kind of went away. I kind of figured it would, but
we'll hook on to the Bruins. You'll love them.
I'll hook on to the Bruins. Yes, sir. So, Mr. Garvey, you're a Bruins fan, obviously, but where are you currently?
I live in Northern California, pretty close to Sacramento, about
Sacramento.
30 miles from Sacramento.
Okay. How long have you been out there?
Well, I've been in California since 1980.
1980. Okay. Okay. And as we were talking before we started recording, you certainly don't sound like somebody from Northern California, and you're a Bruins fan. So, where are you from originally?
Well, here in California, they don't park their cars, so I'm from the Boston area of Massachusetts
Boston
originally.
area. Okay. No, they don't park the cars. I'm a big fan of The Town. If you ever saw that, um, love that. So, really into that stuff. So, you are a square dance caller, obviously, sir. When did you start square dancing?
Well, I've been trying to be a caller for the last 60 odd years. Still working at it.
Okay.
Started when I was 13 years old, back in 1960. Whoops. That, that, gives
1960.
away the, that gives away the age. And yeah, it's been a long and interesting career. I've loved every single minute of it. It's given an awful lot to me, and it's an avocation for me. Um, I've been employed otherwise down through the years, various ways, but it's also been an activity that has really helped me a lot. I was able to educate myself with the funds I received from calling and pick up my college degrees, whatnot. And so I always feel like I owe more to square dancing that I've been able to give to it over the years.
So, when you started dancing and then went into calling, what kind of influences was it callers, or did you just really take to it? How did you get started into calling?
Well, I was a teenage dancer, 11, 12 years old, and we lost our caller at that time to he was drafted into the military, and uh, and they needed somebody to pick up the slack, and I was crazy enough to say, "Let me give it a try." And it was a predictable catastrophe. I had men do-ing with men, and it was a horrible thing. I can still remember it. It 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 marks a young man's memory for life.
I'm
But
sure.
and my friends are all just really uh, it gave them a lot to pick on me about. So I said, well, it kind of crystallized me. I said, well, I'm going to do this or not.
Uh,
So I decided to do it, and we ended up in Andover, Massachusetts, with a teenage group, and eventually we had about 20 squares of teenagers. And of course, this is back when square dancing was very popular. My parents started in a square dance class. It was about 60, 65 squares in the beginner class. And we eventually we started in Andover, and we called ourselves the Starlight Twirlers.
okay.
Uh, from that point on, it I studied really hard. I really did enjoy it. I studied a lot of the callers at the time that I thought were just fantastic. Uh, Two of them, probably my favorite was Frankie Lane.
Okay.
His ability to modulate his voice and get the commands out and just absolutely garner the attention of all the dancers by his voice was phenomenal. And Bob Van Antwerp had this, he was out of California and he had this phenomenal rhythmical style. And I sort of blended the two styles together and developed my own from there.
Now, in today's calling for guys starting out, whatever age they start out at, there's caller schools, and I say all over. There's a lot of caller schools out there. You have one. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the guys that I've talked to that have 30, 40, 50 years, obviously there were really no schools. How did you come up with your ability? I mean, finding the corner, sight calling, memorizing. What did you do?
We never even had those terms back then.
Okay.
It was really so when I came aboard to try to relate what I did in my career with what was going on in square dancing generally, um, uh, out in California, Ed Gilmore had just basically he was in the process of developing this whole scheme, this whole paradigm of breaking the memorized patterns out, which is what everybody was dancing at the time, um, into separate calls. And he had developed a list of the calls. And his theory was if dancers could learn just to execute the calls, then they wouldn't have to memorize these patterns, these dance patterns. And when we were learning, when I learned how to dance, we were basically learning those calls. So I was in that transitional mode where square dancing was transitioning from where dancers would come in and learn how to do a dance routine into actually learning individual calls.
Okay.
And so it was almost impossible to find anybody at that time that could offer educational information to young callers or aspiring callers, regardless of their age. And so what we would do is, a matter of fact, and NECA was the big organization in New England Square Dance Callers. And they brought Ed Gilmore in, and I was fortunate enough to sit down and talk with him at length. And he seemed to be on the fence at that time. He was equivocating whether or not what he had done was the right thing to do, which always stuck with me. And it caused me down through the years to always question every change and every modal change that we were making in square dancing. And so I was always a little reticent to rapidly accept the new ideas that were coming down the pike. Um, and I thank Ed Gilmore for that. Um, I grew up in the era of Al Brundage and Earl Johnston out of New England, and Jim Mayo. And these were the local callers in New England that were carrying the torch. They were the ones that you wanted to go to. They were the go-to guys if you wanted to learn how to call. But there was nothing written down. Every conversation you had to just take it at face value. Then I ran into a book that was written by two callers out of Florida, Dawson and Bell, called The Keys to Calling Square Dancing. And it was a hardbound book. Probably can't find it today, but I still have my copy. And that was the very first introduction I ever had to the mechanical side of choreography.
Mhm.
And I was in high school and college at the time, and so my mind bent easily in that direction to try to look at the scientific side of things, the technical side of things. And it was that book that opened my eyes to the profound ability we had to expand dancing choreography in phenomenal ways. And so the combination of that information led to it expanded the memorized routines, became the modular routines, which then became relational
Mhm.
routines where you were actually able to track dancers, which was the most difficult thing to do at the time. And then into sight calling. And the sight calling was aspect of it was it wasn't ever referred to as site calling at the time. So I'm talking back in 1967, 68. And then you had a couple of callers from the West Coast that were writing books, Bill Davis, Bill Peters. And that's where that was my first introduction to the terms site calling. There was note services at the time, and that was the main source of information that we had. I subscribed to Jack Lazarus note service. I subscribed to the note service out of the Ohio. I forget who was writing that, Orlick, I think. And Southern California, Square Dance College Association had a monthly publication, and the Santa Clara Valley Association had a monthly publication. And I would just devour this stuff. I mean, I subscribed to as much as I could, possibly afford, because I didn't have a lot of money at the time. And probably the same thing is true with callers today, where, I was buying my records at that time for $1 for a vinyl record. And today the callers are spending $10 for an MP3 file.
Yep.
So it's all kind of relative, I guess. The cost factor was there, and it was something that I felt I just had to do. Matter of fact, I still have in my library some of the notes from various publications there. And Lasry was an eye opener, and I had a good chance to meet Jack and work with Jack. I've worked probably with all the guys at one time or another at various festivals. Jack and I did a caller school together in Toms River, New Jersey. I even forget the year, but it was 1969, 1970. And I was on the staff. I didn't have very much to say. I just listened to Jack.
Okay.
And Jack was a profoundly smart guy, and had the amazing ability to be able to transmit his knowledge to people with the spoken word, and which is probably the most difficult aspect today that we have in training callers, is to try to get the newer callers to comprehend what it is we know about the mechanical side of choreographical structure, as well as delivery styles and techniques, which, in my opinion, can only be learned by trying. I grew up in an era where the callers would castigate us and say, don't copy anybody. You never want to be copying anybody, because you can never be better than second best.
Right.
If you copy somebody. But the fact of the matter is, you can't develop your own style until you've actually studied styles of other callers, tried to reproduce those styles in your own way, and then your own style eventually comes out.
Gotcha.
And then you do become unique. And so, and in any event, it was a long, tough process, because there was nothing written outside of the note services. The caller schools in those days were not as organized as they are today. We didn't have Caller Lab.
Okay.
This is all pre-Caller Lab, and it was difficult. I had one caller by the name of Paul Pratt back in Massachusetts, and he charged me. He says, I say, Paul, I need your help. He said, well, can you come over to the house? I said, yeah. He said, well, I'm not going to do it for free. I said, okay. He said, well, how much can you pay? I said, well, I got $3. He says, okay, bring it over. But that's the way we learned. And then Paul would show me a couple of things, and I'd ask him a few questions, and he had trouble answering the questions, because at that time it was all patterns.
Right.
It was all just memorized patterns, and no one had taken the time to break them apart. But at any rate, the bottom line is, Paul helped me an awful lot when I started. Jim Mayo was very influential. At a distance, I never went to a Jim Mayo school. Al Brundage, Earl Johnston, but probably the guy that influenced me the most in the very beginning locally was Dick Jones.
Dick Jones.
Out on Long Island. and Dick was a phenomenal caller. And we had a place out in Eastwater, Massachusetts, called Square Acres. It was owned by a guy named Howard Hogue, and he had built on to this combination. It was like an RV park type thing, and he and his buddies would go out. I don't think the building codes were even invented in those days, and
Okay.
they would go out and add on and add on. So he had about 5 different square dance halls in this one big building that was all patched together by adding one hall onto the next. And it was really weird. And Dick Jones was calling a Saturday night dance, and the place was absolutely packed. There was 40 squares, and Dick Jones was extremely rhythmical. And he called Alaman left and Alamo style, right to you, honey, in balance. And when they balanced, everybody balanced at exactly the same time. And the next thing I saw was Howard Hogue and his buddies running out the front door. And Jones was still calling, swing by the right, swing by the left, and you balance in and you balance out, and you swing by the right, and you swing by the left, and you balance. So I stuck my head out the door, and here these guys trying to jack up the backside of the hall because everybody was balanced so bad. The whole hall was collapsing.
Collapsing. Gosh.
They're running around with 4x4s trying to jack up the hall.
Wow.
Yeah, it was incredible.
That is
Uh,
incredible.
but at any rate, Dick Jones was a phenomenal talent. He was an ex-Marine and just a phenomenal talent. He had a tenor voice, and he was exceptional. And a lot of the guys that I grew up with in the business, Tony Oxendine, Jerry Story, they all studied under Dick Jones.
So you get these influences with Mr. Mayo, Mr. Jones, Mr. Brundage, and all those guys. And like you said, there's no schools. I talked to John Jones out of Texas a few weeks ago, and he was telling me that when somebody would have a question about a call or something, he had about 25 guys' addresses, and you would mail it. And he said it would take about a year for something to come around if they wanted to change a call or do something. And I just can't imagine that because, like you said, with buying records and everything, now I can go on and I can access just about anything I want and get a copy of something within 15 minutes. Just trying to find a record or two. I mean, that's quite a history you have there. So with the calling, did you start traveling around or were you kind of local for a while? Tell me some of the places you've been.
Well, I was a teenage caller, and I rapidly found out that money in the calling business always comes in last.
Mm-hmm. It still does.
I called uh, for a group that had a group over at the Lawrence YWCA called the Wildcats, and there were a couple of times I went home with $10 or $15. Most of the time I went home with donuts, leftover donuts. And that was my fee for the night.
Oh,
Uh, so right off the bat, you learn that it's a labor of love, and that's why you do it. And if you're lucky enough, maybe the money will follow later on.
sure.
And as a matter of fact, it did. I did fairly well over the years, but I developed a group and I called One Night Stand in Reading, Massachusetts, for the Redmonds, and they loved it. And it was a small group. I don't know, 8 squares, 9 squares, and they loved it. And they had me back like just like a month later, and they said, "Let's do it again." So, and then 3 weeks later, they wanted to do it again. And one of the couples that was there that was functional, they were the functional couple, was Dot and Stan and Dorothy Hart. And they came to me and they said, "We want to do this on a regular basis." So that became the core of my first adult club.
Okay.
And I was a teenager at the time. And it became known as the Scarlet Squares. We danced in Lynn, Massachusetts, which is right adjacent to Reading. And later on, I picked up. Well, then I started calling for the Yankee Twirlers out of Woburn, Massachusetts, and that was an interesting gig. There was the hall was octagonal. It wasn't a square hall, and it just so happens that I was on the octagon side next to the restrooms to my left. So that became the heads. So all the couples who had their backs to the restrooms were the head. And the and it was a good club. I mean, we had a lot of people there, and those classes were huge. Matter of fact, the classes were so big they had to restrict how many club angels could come in and dance because the classes were all running 25 squares. And they eventually merged with the Scarlet Squares and formed what they call the Northeast Regional Squares. And I was calling at that time for 4 different adult clubs. And I had a lot of people that wanted to do workshops. And at that time, there wasn't a lot of workshopping going on. That was the time when callers would run their own private workshops, and the names of the clubs would be named for that caller. In other words, the club name was associated with the caller. So John Hendren had the John Jets, and Red Bates had I forget what off the top of my head what his group was called. And so I had a workshop group that eventually became known as Progressive, forget myself. Oh, golly, what was it? Holy smokes. Can't remember my own group. But it was hugely successful. And eventually, I ended up calling workshops in 4 different locations during the week under that banner. And so my focus was on choreography. My focus was on introducing variations of the calls. And it was Partners in Progress was the name of the group. And we had 4 different locations. And it was so successful. And this was prior to the official Color Lab development of advanced dancing. We didn't have Color Lab at the time. And so I had several callers around the country who were following a book that I'd put together as what I was teaching at Partners in Progress. So it was probably the very first syndicated square dance club in the world. As far as I know, I had a chapter in Australia, I had a chapter in Japan, I had a chapter out. Ernie Kinney was calling for his Partners in Progress out in the Fresno area, and it was something. So I was working 4 days a week, 5 days a week, Mondays through Fridays. Well, Mondays through Thursdays, basically, with Partners in Progress. And on the weekends, I would fly anywhere to do festivals or whatever. And I set up a touring, I set up 2 tours a year where I would tour upstate New York all the way out to Chicago. And then from Chicago on down across the Pennsylvania and back home again. And another tour that went down south, but it only went down as far as Washington, D.C. and Delaware, and then swung back up through Pennsylvania and New York in the Syracuse area, and then back across into Massachusetts. So that was what I was doing at the time, and I was full time, and I was teaching school. I was a school teacher at the time.
Okay. It's not very often. So I've born and raised, and I still live in Georgia. It's not often somebody says down south, and they mention it in Washington is where down south was.
That's right. But from Boston, that was way down south.
That's a first for me on that. So Avi, I've heard a lot of your stuff on YouTube. I've followed you for a little while doing that. And what I ask all the callers too, and if you can, first of all, how high do you call level wise?
I used to call through C1.
Okay.
now when I in 1998, I went to work for Hewlett Packard as a software engineer, and I worked in their personal computer division in Cupertino, and we were developing new products, and I was in the new products division, so everything we were doing was to be released 4 years later, that type of thing. Um, and it was very exciting. I really, really enjoyed it. By the time 2002 rolled around, I was managing a software group, and most of my contacts in that group were from Singapore, Taiwan, and in those areas. So it interfered with calling, and I had to give up calling. So I stopped calling in 2004. And at that time, I just gave it up totally, because it's like an addiction,
Sure, sure.
You can't just do a little bit of it. So I had to give it up. I gave it up totally. And I never started back again until 2016. And I'll tell you why. But during that time period, from 2004 on, square dancing had gone through a lot of changes,
Mhm.
and and part of the changes, you know, the choreography and everything, it was it wasn't being delivered well, and it certainly wasn't being danced well, and you could see it on YouTube, and it wasn't the same thing I was involved in years prior, decades prior. It was different. And so I didn't think much of it. Um, I had a local club here in town. President of the club called me on the phone and said, "Look, we're the Jackson Claim Jumpers. We've been around since 1952, and we're getting ready to close our doors if we can't find a caller. Our club caller just retired, and we don't know what to do." So I sat down with him and I said, "One thing you're going to do, if I'm going to be involved, is you're going to do something different, because clearly what you've been doing for the past 2 decades hasn't been working." They had this was a huge club at one time, and they were down to 13 dancers in the club. And so I, at that time, Jerry Story and I were on the phone from time to time. I never lost touch with my buddies. I'd talk to them. I'd talk to Oxendine. I'd talk to Story on the phone. Billy Harrison and so on, and Tom Miller. But Jerry was working at this thing through Collab called eventually became known as SSD. That time it was called Club 50. And I looked at it, and I went to the club in Jackson and I said, "This is what we need. We need to rebuild the base of square dancing. It has to be done that way. You can no longer bring in people off the street and expect them to be plus dancers in a year and think you're going to survive. It's unsustainable. And if you haven't learned that from a club that has, at one time, their club was like 150 members. Now they're down to 13. If that hasn't sunken in yet, then hey, I'll pay for the dinner here tonight, and we'll just call it quits. That's it." But at any rate, they said, "Well, can you draft together what the program will look like?" And I said, "Sure." And we met again, and I said, "Here's what it's going to look like," and so on. And so we started back up in 2016. I started back into calling it 2016. I didn't even know if I could call, Charlie. I hadn't called from 2004. First time I picked up that microphone, I had no idea what was going to come out of my mouth. I just didn't. But you know what? It's like riding a bicycle, and you just never forget. So, but the club really did well, and inside of 2 years, we had built the club up from 13 dancers up to 48. And then in another 2 years, we were up to 82 dancers, just pre-COVID, 82 dancers in the club. And so it was working out very well. After COVID, we dropped back down to 40 some odd, 43, 42. And now we're back up over 80 dancers again.
Wow.
So, yeah, so the formula, I know the formula works. And so I was convinced that I wasn't going to preach it. I wanted to show that it worked. And if people could see that it worked, maybe they would ask the right questions and we could come together and say, okay, here's what you need to do. Some of the clubs have. Many of the clubs have not. And they're they're the obvious ones because they're missing now. They're gone. They're folded up. But the fact of the matter is, if we don't change the way we deliver our product to new customers, then we don't have a chance. We don't have a chance. And like any other activity, it's the most avid people involved in it are always a higher level than the entry level.
Yep.
And what we did was we allowed our higher level to get so far from the entry level that it became almost impossible for new people to join in and feel welcome. So that was the reason, and the cure was to just go back and focus on the basics and give people a chance to dance and enjoy it like they did years ago. And the SSD program, it finally evolved through Color Lab to become the SSD program. I can't say that I'm using SSD anymore because one of the focals of SSD is that it become a standalone program, and I can't do that in California.
Okay.
So I have to at least merge to mainstream. So what I do is I use the SSD teaching approach and the teaching order and sequencing. We do 12-week classes, and so on. We do 3 classes a year, and but then I offer another class after that where they learn the additional 12 calls to become mainstream dancers. So that's the way I'm implementing it here. I can't call it SSD any longer. When I was doing this, it wasn't that stipulation wasn't in SSD. That stipulation entered the SSD concept when certain people realized that Call Lab was not going to embrace it as a standalone program unless it truly was a standalone program. So at any rate, at that time, because with Jerry's passing and all, I wanted to get more involved in the Call Lab level in pushing SSD, but I felt conflicted because I really can't use it myself. I've got to bring people to mainstream. Because we don't live in a vacuum in California. We have too many existing clubs that are plus, and to try to bring in a brand new standalone SSD program, all you're doing is you're becoming a place where the plus clubs will cherry pick out of your group, and so you're fighting a battle on 2 fronts. Never fight a war on 2 fronts.
What I've learned with that is, I mean, I know it's different in different places, but here in Georgia, and surrounding kind of Tennessee area, it's most clubs are mainstream and plus tips. Every now and then you'll run into an advanced club that does some advanced in the middle of that, but it's mainstream and plus. It alternates. There's very few all plus clubs anymore. So then when you start talking about SSD, then you talk to these people who dance plus, and they're like, well, I don't want to stop doing plus. And so there is a balance that you've got to find. So I understand what you're saying with that. And I just finished the SSD program, my first one that I've done with my club, because I just got a club this year, and enjoyed it. And same thing, as soon as we finished, we said, hey, we only had, I think, 8 students to start. Said, hey, now that you're done with SSD, do you want to go into and get the mainstream? And so they hang around and they do the mainstream now. So, but yeah, I see where SSD has some benefits to it for sure. But yeah, being in California, you can't just lock yourself down to that with all the levels you have out there.
No, we still have quite a few dancers, so we have to recognize that you can't divorce yourself from the existing dancing environment. You just can't do it. Now, as far as the SSD goes, and the Jackson Claim Jumpers especially, we had access to our dance hall 2 nights a week. So we could take the dancers who were interested in plus, so we put them on Monday night. And and we dance the plus dancing on Monday night. And on Thursday nights, we do our SSD and our mainstream. So we have every single week the club dances on Mondays and Thursdays. Not all clubs have the ability, the financial ability, or the ability to have access to a hall
Right.
That same way. But that has been one aspect, one characteristic of the success of the claim jumpers is that we can dance 2 nights a week. So the plus dancers still have their own night. And it's worked out very well, even though we don't even identify ourselves as a level. We're just the Jackson claim jumpers. We have plus dancers in there, and we have mainstream dancers, and we have brand new SSD dancers in the club. And when we run our open hoedowns and that type of thing, we try to accommodate as many, depending on who shows up for the dance.
Right.
If we have SSD dancers there, we don't charge them at all to come in. We let them come in, they sit down, and we'll call a tip or two for them.
Right.
Then the mainstream dancers and the plus dancers, they'll pay, and we advertise the dancers as mainstream and plus, and we alternate tips, that type of thing. So that's has kind of worked out. But to go back to your basic question, I called through C1 when I got back into calling in 2016. I picked up a microphone and I started calling advanced, and I'm okay. I'm okay with the advanced, but the C1, something happened at C1 dancing that I can really appreciate the technical aspects of C1, C2, C3, but the dancing is gone. I mean, the music gets in the way. You may as well just not use the music. Just stand up and, circle by a quarter of a quarter. I mean, what the hell you got the music for? These people
Yeah.
they're not moving to the music. And so I had to look at that and say, well, Kip, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to call, and I'm a rhythmical caller. I need the music. I love the music, and I want to see some dancing. So I just decided I'm not going to do C1. I'll just stick to, and I, by the way, I rarely do advanced. I don't have an advanced group. I just do advanced when I need to at various festivals. And there's some advanced groups around here that I'll go and call for once a month just to keep myself fresh.
Right.
That's basically it.
Okay. Of all those calls, do you have a favorite call?
My favorite call is Flutter Wheel.
Flutter wheel. Okay.
Flutter Wheel. My favorite caller for writing calls is Don Beck. He gave us Ferris wheel. He gave us Flutter Wheel. He gave...
All right. I've had a bunch. I've had the Grand Square, of course, and I'm always a fan of Relay the Deucey. I just like to watch the way it works when they're doing it. Like you said, now with sometimes if you have four squares, two of them might not get the Relay the Deucey correctly, just because of where the dancing levels go sometimes. But okay, and another thing I talk about with people is some unique venues. Now, you've told me about an octagon that you called in, and one of them was collapsing. Any other venues stand out to you? It's just a memorable place that you love calling, anything like that?
I love calling. Well, I I can tell you about some different places
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
called.
yeah.
I've called on the Great Wall of China.
Oh my goodness. Okay, tell me about that. How'd that come around? How'd it work out?
Back when Bob and Nita Page were both alive, we took a group of dancers, about 48 dancers, over to China, and it was I think Reagan, no, it was Nixon that opened up China, and this was the first time that we had a chance to go in, and we collaborated with the Chinese Dancing Association, and we spent about a week in China, and we brought our dancers through. So we went in through Guangzhou, was now called Guangzhou, and up through Xi'an. I'll tell you something really interesting. This is going to
Yeah.
fascinate. Yeah, this is it. So you've heard about Xi'an, right? Xi'an is supposed to be the crossroads of the world.
Okay.
Xi'an, China. And this dates back, of course, to the time when it was the world trade with the East, the Oriental East and Europe, went through Xi'an, China. Everything went through China. So the phrase was Xi'an is the crossroads of the world. So Pat and I are going through Xi'an, and we run out of that time we were using Polaroid cameras, because if you took a Polaroid shot of the Chinese people, who by the way would never look you in the eye, because we were the devil, we had devil eyes, and so they would not look us in the eyes. So we would be with the Chinese people, but they'd be looking over our shoulders or left and right, and we would take pictures of them with a Polaroid camera, and we'd hand them the Polaroid afterwards. And they were astounded, absolutely astounded, how this picture would develop right in front of their eyes.
I
And
remember
so
that.
we ran out of film, and we were in this main street of Xi'an, and there's all the little shops, the little porticos, just little indentations, and we went in there to buy some Polaroid film, and we bought it. And we turn around, and here is this ocean of Chinese people standing around us, and ni hao, ni hao, ni hao, and it was actually a little frightening, scary. None of them would look us in the eye, but they were all there. So I just grabbed the camera, held it up, took a picture of it, handed the picture to them, and they passed that picture around, and that was fantastic. Well, that got the attention of some other tourists who were coming through.
Oh,
The tourists came over to see what was going on. And the tourists that had come down recognized Pat, one of them. And it was Pat's orthodontist. And he had come in across the Trans-Siberian through Russia and the Trans-Siberian Railway and down through Beijing, and was heading down to Guangzhou and through Xi'an. And here we are in Xi'an, crossroads of the world. She meets her orthodontist.
it's definitely the crossroads of the world. And gosh,
Yeah, just incredible. So at that time, of course, we went up to the Great Wall of China, and we were up there with our dancers, and we put them together in a square, and we danced on the Great Wall. We
oh,
also danced in Tiananmen Square. Um, Tiananmen Square, of course, is huge. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but
I
it,
am. I mean, I from TV, so I can't get a grasp on the size.
it's huge. Acreage is huge, and and next thing you know, I put a square together and we're dancing. Next thing we know, we're surrounded with machine gunned, armed soldiers. We didn't know that it was the burial place of Mao Zedong.
A flash mob in Tiananmen Square. Oh my gosh.
So that didn't go over very well.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
And our Chinese national, you had to have two guides in China. You had a local guide from the local area, and you had a national guide that stayed with you all through China. And the national and the local guide did quite a bit of talking to get us out of trouble there.
Well, dancing on the burial site. Great. That's good.
Yeah, and yeah, and we did go over to the what's the name of those tombs? Oh golly. It's now two professional 18-hole golf courses, but at that time it was a very sacred burial
Okay.
ground. And anyway, it was a heck of an experience. And we went from there over to China,
Hmm.
and where I met my buddy Mata Sonuma. So we were staying at the in Tokyo. I trying to think of the name of the hotel, but it's the big one right downtown Tokyo. And Mat Asanuma meets us there, and he's our connection for the dance I was going to do that later that day. And I'd been traveling through China, and I had a sports coat, and I had uh, this nudie shirt. You know, nudie is the guy that makes all the Western wear for, and the nudie shirt was beautiful. It was red with white piping, and it was a it was a rodeo shirt. It was gorgeous. And I turned to Matt and I said, Matt, what do you think I should wear tonight? This, and I held up the sports coat, or should I hold, or this, and I held up the nudie red rodeo shirt. And Matt looks at it and says, oh, for me? And he grabs hold of that radio, the rodeo shirt. And I said, "Oh, Matt, look, the sleeves are way too long. Let me have this done. I'll have one made for you and I'll send it back to you." He says, "No problem. Wife a seamstress." so so I let my rodeo shirt go to Matt Asanuma, and we went to call the dance that night. And Matt wants to do a singing call with me. and and he wears the shirt, the sleeves. I mean, the beginning of the cuffs started at the end of his fingertips. and and I said, "Oh, okay, Matt, what do you want to do?" And he hands me the record, and I put the record on. He says, he says, "You do melody, I do harmony." I said, "Okay." So I've got this group of square dancers from the United States. They're all dancing down front. And circle left. Why don't you rub me like you used to do? that's, that's all my American dancers are going, "Oh my God." But at any rate, I got a picture in the, he sent me a photo later on in the mail, of course. Got it about 6 weeks later. And his wife, in fact, had done up the sleeves of this thing, and he was wearing that rodeo shirt. And it fit him like
Nice.
gorgeous, and a big white Stetson hat. And,
That's great.
oh man, that was great. But
Well,
those,
did you get to replace your nudie shirt with a different one?
oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, good, good.
Oh, no problem with that. That's, I was in California at the time. If you couldn't get a nudie shirt in California, you couldn't buy gold at a discount. So, but it, but the Japanese dances were very interesting. For one thing, um, they they dance nonstop. First of all, I learned that the Japanese custom is husbands and wives don't have the same hobby. They have different hobbies. It's a cultural thing. And so a lot of the dancers who were there, uh, they might have been married, but they weren't married to each other. And they came in on the trains and they would change for the dance. And we had a full hall. I mean, it was huge. Um, and they would all dance with each other. And as soon as they get done, they would thank each other, turn around, and whoever they ran into next, they'd immediately form another square. And they'd be standing there waiting for you to call. So I was calling tip after tip after tip. Now, normally, what do we call? 8, 9 tips a night.
Mhm.
In the first hour, I bet I called 6 tips. My throat's starting to go. Everything's starting to burn up. And they're having a ball. But the fact of the matter is, it was the longest dance I ever called in my life.
I've heard that there's no stopping. Even now, you
Oh,
go over
no,
there and it's continual
they don't,
dancing.
they don't stop at all. They dance on and on. And, 3-hour dance, man, I was wasted.
Oh, that's that. Like I told you before we started. I do this podcast for stories, and man, these are some of the classic ones. The Great Wall of China and Tiananmen Square, and man,
Yeah.
that's something else. That's one thing about square dance calling. Of course, I haven't got to travel like that yet. I've hit about 9 different states. My goal is to hit all of them before I'm done. Um, and so and you see different things, but man, I can't imagine calling on the Great Wall of China. That's something else there.
Oh, that was something. I got to tell you, that was something. I've called you remember the original 747s had a staircase in them,
Hmm.
spiral staircase that went up.
Yeah, yeah.
I've I called right around the staircase and had dancers dancing around the staircase. They got their Mile High Club badge.
No, that's good. Oh, that's good.
And I'll tell you another story.
Yeah,
Are we telling stories? Or
yeah,
well,
absolutely.
I
Tell them
think we're
all.
telling stories. So we did the thing called I'll think of it in a minute. But anyway, we became very close friends with Jerry Junk, and Jerry Junk and I had the misfortune of looking very much alike.
Okay.
Neither one of us are very good looking. And but Margie Sheffield, Elma's wife, and Ann McMillan, Daryl McMillan's wife, were good friends of ours at that time, and they and we always kidded around with each other. So at any rate, Jerry and I are doing a weekend, a festival someplace back east, and Jerry comes. He's got a big smile on his face, and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "I think I just met one of your friends." I said, "What happened?" He says, "I got in an elevator." He says, "And mind you, Kip, I'm minding my own business." He said, "When these two girls come in and they say, 'Kip Garvey,' and they wrap their arms around me and they gave me a great big kiss and a great big hug." And it was Ann McMillan and Margie Sheffield thinking that they were with Kip Garvey in the elevator.
Oh,
and, and Jerry came back and he gets up on the stage and he calls, he comes off the stage. He says, "I think that was the best damn tip I ever called."
that's a good story. Gosh. Oh, well, keep going. You got any more stories? Let me hear them.
Oh, are you kidding me? I've got 60 years worth of stories.
Okay. Well,
There's another caller. I won't mention his name.
okay.
Uh, I won't mention his name. But he was a young caller, and we were calling in with Keith Ripito. We were calling in West Virginia, I think it was, RV park. And me and this young caller, and Keith was, of course, Keith is the anchor guy. He sets up the weekend, so he was calling with us. But um, I did the morning workshop, and this other caller was supposed to do the afternoon workshop. And he's a young guy. We were both young at the time, but he was much younger than me. And we had some folks in from Kentucky, RVers, and and so they said, "Well, why don't you come on over to the rig for lunch?" And so we said, "Okay." So we both went over to the RV, and a bunch of people were around there. And she serves us some like tuna fish sandwiches or something, and then she comes out with the brownies.
Oh, okay.
And she says, "Have a brownie." So I took a bite of the brownie, and I said, "Whoa, I think I'll nibble from here on out." Well, the other young caller hadn't been into this at all. He didn't know what was going on. He said, "Oh, these are the best damn brownies I ever had." So now he's on his third brownie, and I'm saying, "Man, you got to call the workshop this afternoon." He said, "What? What?" He says, "That's okay." He said, I can handle this. Old guys like you maybe can't handle three brownies, but I can handle three brownies." I said, "I don't think you can handle these three brownies." I walked into the stage, and this guy is about halfway through introducing himself. And I had to walk up to the stage and say, "I think I'll take care of the afternoon workshop." Oh, that was so funny.
Don't let
I
me forget when we come to an end on this. I want to know who that was.
ah!
But we won't talk about it on here. We won't talk about it on here.
No, but I gotta tell you, it was something else. It was, I mean, nobody got hurt. It was no harm, no foul. I basically covered for the kid, grabbed that mic because I could see what was going on. Yeah, I could tell by his slurred speech and everything. He had no clue.
Oh my
So I took care of it. But yeah, those are the kind of things that sometimes happen when
sure.
you when you're not paying attention.
Yeah. Oh. Well, tell me about your caller school that you have online. When did that come about, and what do you do with it? How's that work?
Well, it's in spite of anything you might read to the contrary, it's the very first college school that was online. Somebody, well, at any rate, the the idea was I've done a lot of brick and mortar college schools, where you go, and I've seen the burnout. Um, Sometimes it happens in the very first night, after the very first session. The eyes are big and pupils are dilated and the mind is going. And yeah, and I look at these poor callers and I say, how the heck are they going to survive the next 3 days at a college school when they can barely make it through the first 3 hours? because they're just getting snowed. And so I thought, well, if I put together an online caller school and young aspiring callers, whether they want to become callers or not, this was a good way for them to get their feet wet. And then if they did go to a brick and mortar caller school, they had some preparation. They at least had the terminology down, instead of walking into a vocabulary that's totally foreign to them, chicken plucker and all this kind of stuff.
Yep.
They would know what a chicken plucker was. They understand the idea about symmetric choreography. They understand concepts of like key dancers and why you want to watch them and what's going on with them. And so I said, okay, I'm going to put together this caller school because everything's being done online anyway. And so it took me a long time to prepare that college school, design the curriculum. And I designed it around 10 lessons. And the idea was they would have the lessons that they could do at their own pace. And then I built a library that they could go to called reference material. And in that library would be all kinds of documents, many of which I'd written over the years, but a lot of other documents as well that other callers had written that had strategic value. And that gives them a huge library where they could go at their own pace, learn the terminology, learn the concepts, struggle with the early ideas that most callers have so much trouble with. And maybe then when they get to a caller school, a brick and mortar caller school, they got a head start. That was the whole idea behind it.
That's great. That really is. Because I've been to a lot of caller schools all over. And I get that. The first couple, I was coming in cold. I had some mentors around this area, and I'd been calling for about 6-7 years. And I went to a couple caller schools, and it's just like that. You're just like, and first of all, you don't want to make mistakes, and you're going to make mistakes regardless. And, you're up there in front of people that you've seen on YouTube, or you've bought music that they've produced, and you're like, oh, and they tell you to invert and rotate. And you're like, I have no idea what that means, or things like that. And so, yeah, it can be overwhelming for sure. So what you've done there, that sounds great. Because going into a caller school with a little idea of, like you said, the wording of it, chicken plucker. I mean, because it's just pounded into you the first couple times you go to a school. And so, well, that's fantastic, man. I'm going to look in more deeply into that. I just Jet Roberts sent me your website, and that's how we connected and all that. Jet's a good friend of mine, and he thinks very highly of you. And so I said, well, let me look into it. And so then I saw your website, and that's how we got connected there. So tell me about you and Jet, since he put it. You both come to California. I'm guessing is where that came from.
Jet and I have one thing in common. I think Jet started calling when he was 10 years old. I started calling when I was 13. And still there's a decade and a half between us. But Jet, I'll tell you what, I've been calling a long time. I have a lot of acquaintances that are callers, and we get along just great, but darn few friends. And Jet is a real friend. Jet's somebody I can count on. And he understands my weaknesses. We all have them. And he understands where I've been and what I've gone through, because he's done the same thing. Excuse me. And he's a super talented guy. And I admire anybody that's taken the time that he has taken to really learn the trade. And this guy entertains dancers, period. He is the quintessential entertainer of dancers.
Absolutely.
Now, there are darn few callers that I would attribute those characteristics to. Jerry Story was one of them. Tony Oxendine's another one. I mean, there's a short list, but but Jet is right there, and he's top of the notch, top of the pile. And right now he's He moved from California, went out to Alabama, which I I joke with him all the time about. I said, how much you make last week, Jet? I don't want to talk about it. I said, well, I made $300. I only worked one night. I don't want to talk about it. So,
Oh,
but yeah, we've ridden the motorcycles together. We've done the RVing together. Sylvia is wonderful. She gets along well with Pat. But for the most part, I really admire Jet for his ability to comprehend his dance floor, figure out what they need to have fun, and then deliver, because he can do it and he does it consistently.
one thing I thought about it. You said it early on tonight when we were talking about how you were still um, figuring things out and learning things. When I talked to Jet, and I've talked to Jet numerous times now, but he even said when I was doing a podcast with him that he still pushes checkers pretty much every day. He's always working on choreography. And for somebody who's been doing it for as long as he has, that means a lot because you think these guys, once they learn it, they don't have to work at it anymore. They can go up there and see what they're going to do. But he works at it. He works choreography every day. And Jerry Story was the same way, from what I understand. I got to meet Jerry once before he passed away at a caller school, so I never got to spend time with him. But those guys, him and Tony, they're constantly working choreography and entertaining, and so that's something I've learned. Now, this is hard for some people to do. Because it's a general question. Do you have any advice for callers, whether it be a first year caller or a caller that's been calling for 10, 12 years like myself?
I will say this for brand new callers that are starting out, learn to call to two couples. Forget about the full square. You need to get the new caller needs to get control over calling to just two couples. Um, that limits your vocabulary so that you don't have to worry about relay the deuces and all this nonsense. Um, and it also gives you an opportunity to see the mechanical relationship between four dancers and bringing them back home, and that what that really means. New callers need to call to two couples, and it's so much easier to do that. One of the biggest problems new callers have is getting people to call to. You don't have to go to another caller's dance and say and beg, oh, can I call a tip? That's that puts the caller who's calling the dance at ill at ease, and it puts the new caller ill at ease. You got to have two couples that will come over to your house, push the kitchen table aside, and call. You don't need music. You don't need anything really. I mean, if you want to play music, play it on a small little boom box,
Mhm.
and call in your kitchen. Bring out the goodies, the snacks, and the drinks and whatnot, and just call the two couples. You can do so much training, self-training with two couples, and it's the most beneficial thing in the world because after you've been calling for 10 years like yourself, what do you find out? You're basically only calling four dancers at a time.
Mhm.
You're only focused on four dancers at a time. So why not learn that trade right up front? Learn that skill right up front. And so and for the 10 and 12-year dancer, caller rather, I would say it's time to really understand the mechanics of the choreography. Learn about group theory, learn about relationships. The biggest thing that's missing in caller schools today is training on relationships. Most callers who are really adept at it, your Jet Roberts, your Tony Oxendines, the guys that you go to and admire, and you say to them, how did he see that? Where did he start? What's going on with that? You got 1,000 questions, but what you don't know is that guy has accomplished the skill of understanding relationships. He knows where he is. He knows where every dancer in that square is all the time. He knows what the potential pairings are. And the terminology that we use now, it's relatively new, is group theory. And if you concentrate on that, then you'll begin to understand the structure of the choreography. Invert and rotate becomes a very simple thing to understand at that time. And so I would say, if, for the 8 to 10 year caller, if you haven't taken the time to study relationships, do that. Um, the problem, I think, and I'm accusing myself when I say this, many of the trainers of callers in the past, myself included, have tried to rush callers into sight calling. And sight calling is very effective. And you'll find that even when you call into two couples, your brand new caller is going to rely on some degree of sight calling. But sight calling is an umbrella term, and it encompasses everything else. And if you don't know relationships, you can get lost in sight calling. And I think you've probably seen it. I know I've seen it, where callers are calling, 32, 40 calls because they're basically lost. They're trying to find some relationship that they can recognize in order to resolve. And maybe that's because their pilot square is dumped, or whatever. But the idea is, I've seen sight calls go on and on and on. I saw Jerry Story share the stage with another guy where and this is a full tip. This is a 5-minute tip, where Jerry actually called for a total of about 45 seconds, twice, two separate times. And the other guy was a sight caller that was lost. And he ate up all of the tip, just trying to get himself around to it. So I'm not saying that sight calling is a bad thing. Don't misunderstand me. Sight calling is a good thing, but the gap that's missing is understanding those relationships. It's like, think of it as a grand chess master. A grand chess master has in his head 1,000 different boards in his head. And when you're playing with a grand chess master, he'll see the board and recognize that board right away and know the relationship of all the pieces that are on that board. And that's true with a sight caller who also understands relationships. He's got all these relationships in his head. When he sees that in front of him, he knows exactly where he is. And whether or not the dancers are with him are still going, that caller can still resolve. And he doesn't have to call 30 more calls to do it. He can get them out in 3 calls
Right.
from wherever he's at any time.
That is some great advice there, sir. Thank you. I tell people too, I do the podcast to get people's stories out and things like that, but it's also it's a free school for me. So I try and pick up on little things while I'm doing it. And what I've done too, I know you've got to watch a few of the podcasts. I like to talk a little bit about yourself, and I don't know, do you consider yourself a movie guy or a TV guy? What do you like to do when you're not calling?
I'm a golfer.
Golfer.
I'm a golfer. I golf.
I noticed earlier, are you on a golf course?
I am. Yeah.
Okay.
Matter of fact, let's see. I don't know if you can see it or not, but that's the number 12 green behind me.
Very nice. Okay. Yep. I saw that. I love playing golf myself. So you like to play golf. And I ask this of everybody, and you tell me what you think. If you had to choose Footloose or Dirty Dancing, what's your favorite movie?
Footloose or Dirty Dancing?
Yeah.
Dirty Dancing.
Okay. Any particular reason?
Yeah, because you only gave me 2 options. I had to pick one.
Okay. All right. Well, you grew up with square dance music. I didn't even ask you this. Have you recorded any music? Do you have a favorite singing call?
Okay. So I started doing singing calls with Jay Barquet, which was John Hendren and Ken Anderson back in Massachusetts. I then recorded on Thunderbird label. And from Thunderbird label, I went to Rhythm Records.
Okay.
And I recorded with Rhythm for a number of years. And when I left Rhythm Records, I started my own label called Eureka Recordings.
You've just started that back, yeah?
Just fired that back up again. Yep. So do I have a favorite singing call? No, I love them all.
Okay.
I really do. And the singing calls are like frosting on the cake. It can be done so many different ways to give a different impression. I mean, singing calls are used to really add the flavor, the depth, and the character to a dance. So, um, no, I don't have a favorite, but I can tell you that I love doing them.
Well, if you're not listening to square dance music, what's your music genre that you like the most?
Probably country rock.
Country rock. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. Garvey, we've covered a lot. We've been going for about an hour and 10 minutes or so. And I know you've got the 60 years of stories, so I would absolutely love to do this again down the road so I can hear some more stories because you've absolutely amazed me with all of them. I love them. And I would like to talk more about the Eureka records and the stuff you got coming out, stuff like that. Is there anything else you want to cover tonight?
No, I do appreciate you taking the time to listen to an old man ramble on a little bit. Uh,
No,
uh,
that's why I did this. I love the stories; those are great stories. And I take notes. I'm writing down what everybody tells me. Favorite calls and stories and things like that. And you've set the bar pretty high with the Great Wall of China and Tiananmen Square.
uh,
Um, so there's some others I'm going to talk to, and we'll see where it goes from there. But Mr. Garvey, I want to thank you for doing this tonight. It's 9:20 here. Obviously, it's about 6:20 there. I'm guessing. It looks nice out there on the golf course. Hopefully, I'll get to see you. Or are you planning on coming to Caller Lab next year or anything like that?
I will be at Grapevine in Grapevine, Texas.
Fantastic, good.
Uh,
So maybe we can actually sit down and have something to drink and talk about a few things.
that
Uh,
sounds great to me.
and I will be in contact. I'd love to do another podcast with you. Mr. Garvey, it's my pleasure. I will talk to you soon, sir. It's have a good call the next time you're out there.
Well, I'll tell you what, thank you very much for the service you do for your community as a police officer.
Yes, sir.
It's much appreciated by all of us. And Charlie, I hope I get a chance to meet you at Grapevine.
Yes, sir. Kip, it's good talking to you, buddy. Bye bye.